I get it, they're idiots, or better they fed him. We dare them. The police got wedding, is in a wedding is Southern Cross. Flame, we dead him. The police go wedding, is in a wedding is in a wedding is flame, we dead him.
Philip Simpson does not merely have a defense. He possesses a catastrophic arsenal of evidence that mathematically destroys the state's entire narrative.
Love this land, my station brings handstand. Beauty a match, war, life has patched that. Fuck you, fuck the gov, corrupt the child, dove above. Cops, criminals, animals, sinners, spins.
Welcome to The Explainer. I am absolutely thrilled to have you here today because we are launching right into part 1 of a gripping 5-part documentary series. Over the course of this series, we're going to be unraveling the truly chilling history of Australian serial killers. We're looking at some of the absolute darkest corners of human nature, and we're starting right at the roots of organized, repeated murder in Australia. By digging into historical data and old police records, we're going to see exactly how these terrifying crimes evolved over time.
So here's our roadmap for today's Explainer. We'll start with early Australian serial killers. Then we'll examine the baby farmers, followed by Auntie Tholly's deadly tea. After that, we'll look at MacDonald the Mutilator. And finally, we'll wrap the whole thing up by analyzing the evolution of evil.
All right, let's jump straight into Section 1. Early Australian Serial Killers, a Chronology of Darkness. To really understand this, we are anchoring ourselves across 3 distinct eras. We're going to start back in 1892, looking at crimes that were entirely rooted in Victorian-era greed and just desperate financial survival. Then we'll shift gears to the post-war 1950s, an era that was defined by this hidden domestic malice. And finally, we'll arrive in the early 1960s, plunging headfirst into a totally new, random breed of psychological horror. This timeline is going to serve as our compass as we navigate through the Explainer today. Moving right along to Section 2, the baby farmers John and Sarah Mackin. Let's dive into Sydney. The year is 1892. We meet a married couple who were really struggling to make ends meet, and they turn to something called baby farming. Now, this was a Victorian-era concept where people would take in illegitimate or unwanted children in exchange for a premium fee. The truly chilling irony here is how the Mackins presented themselves. Sarah actually advertised herself as a ladies' nurse and midwife, basically promising a parent's love and care. But as you'll see, the reality was unspeakably different. Because instead of caring for these infants, the pair just took the money and callously murdered them. The whole thing unraveled when a man who was just laying a service pipe in the backyard of a terraced house on Vernon Street literally dug up an infant's body. From there, police started a massive, systematic search. They were out there with pickaxes and spades, digging up the yards of the Mulkins' previous residences across George Street and Alderson Street in Redfern, and what they found was horrific. They found the remains of infants wrapped in blankets, pieces of calico, and some were even stuffed straight into the drain pipes. 13. That is the sheer gravity of their desperate greed. A total of 13 little bodies were discovered. They were buried in backyards and hidden in the plumbing of the homes the Mackins had rented, just moving from suburb to suburb over the course of 2 years. Those were the actual chilling words of the sentencing judge, directed straight at John Mackin. The Mackins were tried for murder. The jury found them guilty, and John Mackin was executed by hanging in Darlinghurst Gaol in 1893. Now, Sarah Mackin was originally sentenced to death too, but her sentence was later commuted to penal servitude for life. It was a trade of pure, fatal greed. Which brings us to Section 3, Auntie Tholly's deadly tea. This is the case of Carolyn Grills. Now we're fast-forwarding to the mid-20th century, and we're seeing how evil can hide behind the absolute most domestic, unassuming facade you could possibly imagine. On one hand, you have her public persona. She was this short, hospitable woman with thick-rimmed glasses. Everyone affectionately called her Auntie Carrie. She'd visit family and friends, always bringing these sweet cakes, biscuits, and tea. But let's look at the reality. She was actually lacing those treats with thallium. That's a highly toxic chemical usually used to poison rats. She mainly targeted her in-laws, people she simply wasn't fond of. She ended up murdering 4 relatives and attempted to murder a 5th.
To wrap up the story of her hidden domestic crimes, here are the objective facts of how it all ended. She was originally sentenced to death for the poisonings, but that sentence was later commuted. She spent her remaining years locked up and ultimately died in prison in 1960, meaning she took the exact reasons for her spiteful murders right to the grave. Okay, let's look at Section 4, MacDonald the Mutilator, William MacDonald. Moving into the early 1960s, we confront a completely random breed of psychological horror. The really crucial point here is that William MacDonald was one of the very first Australians to officially be given the title of serial killer, which kind of makes you wonder, doesn't it? If the term itself was only born here in the 1960s, just how many undetected systemic killers existed before him, operating without any proper psychological classification? So what actually drives an irresistible urge to kill? It's a deeply chilling question, but it's one we have to ask as we look at MacDonald's confession. When he was finally apprehended, he told the police that he was just filled with this insane, irresistible urge to kill. He claimed this urge drove him to target male victims, and it was a dark compulsion that he actually traced back to being assaulted when he was a teenager. The historical record lays out his grim methods pretty clearly. MacDonald selected random male victims from the inner city regions of Sydney and Brisbane, and he would lure them into dark parks. Then, he would stab them and severely mutilate them. He disposed of the severed parts by just throwing them into Sydney Harbor, or in one recorded instance, carrying them away in a plastic bag. I mean, the nature of these crimes was so graphic, so gruesome, that some jurors reportedly fainted right there in the courtroom during his trial. And then there's this bizarre irony about his incarceration. MacDonald was found to be legally insane at the time he committed the murders, but years later, he was actually deemed sane enough to be released from prison. But get this, he declined. He said no. He was terrified of the exact same outside world that he had once terrorized, so he chose to stay behind bars. He eventually died in custody at the age of 90, making him Australia's oldest and longest-serving prisoner.
And that brings us to Section 5, the evolution of evil, summarizing Part 1.
We've really traced a dark path today. Back in the 1890s with the Macons, the motive was profit. It was desperate survival that somehow twisted into mass murder in inner-city backyards. Then, by the 1950s, with Caroline Girls, that motive morphed into domestic malice, literally murder carried out with a smile and a warm cup of tea. And by the 1960s, with William MacDonald, the motive fractured entirely into psychopathy. It became about random, terrifying acts in the dark parks of Brisbane and Sydney. You can see how the motives evolved from the rational, albeit evil, pursuit of money, all the way down into the deeply irrational depths of the human psyche. Which leaves us with this final, really provocative thought. With the 1960s bringing the official birth of the term serial killer in Australia, the psychological floodgates were officially opened. The methods were getting more complex, the motives were becoming wildly erratic. So what modern horrors awaited the country in the decades to follow? Keep that question in the back of your mind because that is exactly what we are going to uncover in Part 2 of this series. Thank you so much for joining me today to break down this history, and I'll see you in the next explainer.
Okay, let's dive into this explainer. Today, we're unpacking Part 2 of our deep dive into Australian serial killers, focusing entirely on a man who completely destroyed the illusion of safety on the open road. I'm talking about Ivan Milat and the horrific backpacker murders. Picture it, Australia in the late 80s and early 90s. The Hume Highway is stretching out endlessly through this gorgeous, vast landscape. It practically glowed with this neon noir sense of freedom, right? Everyone thought they were absolutely safe. But lurking just out of sight, right in the shadows of that open road, was a predator who turned that ultimate freedom into a deadly trap.
So what happens when the ultimate adventure literally becomes your worst nightmare? See, up until the mid-90s, hitchhiking in Australia wasn't just common, it was a total rite of passage. It was this cheap, fun, super adventurous way for young backpackers from all over the world to explore. You just grab your pack, stick out your thumb, and totally trust in the kindness of strangers heading your way. But the terrifying events we're about to explore, they completely shattered that innocence. They took what should have been the trip of a lifetime and warped it into an absolute horror story.
Section 1. Horror in Belanglo Forest. Let's head back to September 1992. Deep in the rugged, totally isolated Australian bush, Belanglo State Forest. It's incredibly dense, deeply quiet, far, far away from the bright lights of Sydney. On September 19th, two runners are out orienteering. Suddenly, They stumble upon something terrifying, a concealed corpse. The very next morning, police find a second body just 30 meters away. Dental records quickly confirm the absolute unthinkable. These were Caroline Clark and Joanne Walters, two British backpackers who vanished back in April. And the scene was just unspeakably brutal. Walters had been stabbed 15 times. Clark shot 10 times in the head at the burial site. Investigators quickly realized she'd actually been subjected to horrific target practice.
7. Over the next year, that staggering number would become the true, horrifying scale of the tragedy unearthed right out of the forest floor. 7 young lives violently taken. For the families back home, this was the agonizing, absolutely heartbreaking end to months and, in some cases, years of desperate searching. The world's media swooped in immediately, broadcasting a chilling warning to the globe. Tourists had to be on high alert. A serial killer was actively hunting on Australia's highways. Section 2. The Missing Backpackers.
And this brilliantly illustrates just how incredibly long this killer operated with total impunity, like an absolute ghost. We're talking about vibrant, adventurous young adults from all over the map. There was a young Aussie couple, James Gibson and Deborah Everest. From Germany, Simone Schmidl, plus another young couple, Gabor Neugebauer and Anja Habschied. And of course the British friends, Joanne and Caroline. Just consider the massive gaps here. Gibson and Everest vanished first, way back in December 1989. Over a whole year goes by before Schmidl disappears in January 1991. Later that same year, Neugebauer and Habschied vanish. Then Clark and Walters in April 92. It wasn't until September 1992, nearly 3 whole years after the first disappearance, that anyone found a single body.
As investigators analyzed the remains, a heavily sadistic, terrifyingly consistent pattern emerged. Each victim was dumped in remote bushland near campsites. That tells us the killer was clearly spending a lot of time with them during and after the murders. Their bodies were carefully hidden under these deliberate pyramids of sticks and ferns. The violence was extreme, and it was incredibly targeted. We're talking paralyzing spinal stab wounds specifically meant to physically drop the victims, blunt force trauma, multiple gunshot wounds from a .22 caliber rifle, and in one absolutely tragic case, decapitation. Section 3. The One Who Escaped. Now, amidst all this darkness, we actually get an incredible anchor of hope. Meet Paul Onions, a young British backpacker. Let's rewind to January 1990, years before any bodies were found. Paul is hitchhiking south of Sydney looking for work, and he gets picked up by this muscular guy who calls himself Bill. So they're driving south of Mittagong, which is critically less than a kilometer from Belanglo State Forest, when suddenly Bill yanks the car over to the side of the road. He pulls out a revolver, he grabs some ropes, and he looks right at Paul and says those terrifying words, "It's a robbery, put on your seatbelt." But Paul, he wasn't having it. Fueled by pure, unadulterated adrenaline, he scrambled right out of that car. He is literally dodging actual gunfire from his pursuers, sprinting frantically down the Hume Highway. He leaves his bags, his passport, his entire life behind in this desperate scramble to survive. And miraculously, he flags down a passing motorist, Joanne Barry. They floor it to safety, heading straight to the Borough Police, where Paul gives them a full description of the attacker and his four-wheel drive. But at the time, it just seemed like a really scary but isolated attempted robbery. Section 4. Connecting the dots. Let's move on and see how this builds into a massive break in the case. By late 1993, Task Force Air, the police team hunting the killer, was just drowning. They had a solid profile, but they were sifting through 58 different missing persons cases. Talk about a needle in a haystack. But then, the golden tip arrives. In November 1993, Paul Onions is back in the UK. He's watching the international news, sees the reports about the bodies in Belanglo, and it hits him. His terrifying ride with Bill. He immediately calls the Aussie police. It takes some serious digging, but by April 1994, detectives finally unearthed that original, handwritten notebook entry from the Borough Pop 4 years prior. The next month, they fly Paul back to Australia. He sits down, looks at a video lineup, and without hesitation, positively identifies his attacker, a man named Ivan Milat.
Now, what's really interesting here is just how perfectly Ivan Milat fits the profile Task Force Air had meticulously put together. Police were looking for a local, someone with a four-wheel drive, an obsession with weapons, and easy, regular access to hitchhikers. Well, enter Ivan Milat. He literally worked for the Roads and Traffic Authority, giving him endless, unchecked access to the Hume Highway. He had a widely known obsession with firearms. And, incredibly suspiciously, he had just sold off his silver Nissan Patrol four-wheel drive right after those first bodies were pulled from the forest. It was a perfect match.
Section 5. The Arrest and Trial.
Taking down Ivan Milat was never going to be easy. This was a man from a family very well known to police, with a documented history of violence and a massive, dangerous cache of firearms. They needed an overwhelming, highly coordinated tactical strike. 300. That's how many heavily armed police officers rolled out on the early morning of May 22, 1994. Elite officers from the Tactical Operations Unit swarmed Milat's house in Eagleville, hitting the properties of his mother and 5 of his brothers simultaneously. They were taking absolutely zero chances.
And what they uncovered during those raids was straight out of a horror movie, a literal trophy room. At Milat's own home, they found parts of a Ruger 1022 rifle that perfectly matched the murder weapons. But that's not all. They found the victims' actual sleeping bags, their tents, cameras, and clothing. Over at his mother's house, locked securely in a cupboard, was a long cavalry sword, the exact type of heavy blade used in the horrific beheading of Anja Habshid. And across all the family properties combined, police seized a staggering 24 weapons and 250 kilograms of ammunition. The physical evidence was utterly irrefutable. Milat was the monster of Belanglo. So the crucial point is that justice finally caught up with him. After an absolutely exhausting 18-week trial with 145 witnesses taking the stand, the jury found Ivan Milat guilty of all 7 murders on July 27, 1996. The judge handed down 7 consecutive life sentences, with absolutely no possibility of parole. But here's the crazy part. He completely refused to confess. Ever. Once he was locked away in Supermax, he pulled these totally bizarre stunts just to demand appeals. He went on a hunger strike because he wanted a PlayStation to exercise his mind. And in 2009, he literally hacked off his own finger with a plastic knife and mailed it to a judge. But he stubbornly maintained his innocence right up until the day he died in 2019.
But honestly, the most chilling reality of this whole explainer is that Milat's reign of terror almost certainly didn't begin or end with those 7 backpackers. Remember, Task Force Air initially looked at 58 missing persons cases. Police strongly suspect his violent spree started way earlier. They look at heartbreaking cold cases like Kieran Rowland, who vanished way back in 1971, or Peter Letcher, found murdered in 1987, and Diane Panacchio, abducted in 1991. Every one of these victims was either hitchhiking or found dumped in remote bushland, bearing injuries that shockingly mirror Milat's incredibly specific, sadistic MO.
Because of a lack of concrete evidence, he was never officially charged with these additional crimes. But it leaves us with this incredibly haunting final thought. We know Ivan Milat officially took 7 lives. But when you factor in his lifelong history of extreme violence, his non-stop access to the highways, and the trail of unresolved cold cases that perfectly match his terrifying signature, you really have to wonder, how many more secrets did Australia's most notorious serial killer actually take to the grave?
Hey everyone, welcome back, and let's just dive right into this. As part 3 of our 5-part explainer on Australia's most notorious serial killers, we are examining a case today that honestly absolutely defies human comprehension. We're talking about a story of deep psychological manipulation, incredibly insular trust, and just unimaginable cruelty. We're looking at the Snowtown Bodies in the Barrels murders. This was a chilling spree orchestrated by John Bunting and his accomplices that ultimately left 12 people dead. Now, I do want to warn you, the details we're covering today are incredibly intense. But understanding exactly how these men operated and how they were finally caught gives us a really profound look into the absolute darkest corners of criminal psychology.
To really grasp the legacy of this crime, we actually have to start by looking at where the story ends up today. Snowtown is this tiny, quiet wheat belt town in South Australia, maybe 150 kilometers north of Adelaide. The population hovers right around 400 people. It's one of those places where literally everyone knows everyone. But, as the current owner of the infamous former bank notes, they still get true crime tourists every single day. You have this quiet, totally innocent rural community that got completely overshadowed by dark tourism, forced onto the global stage just because of a macabre discovery made inside their local, disused bank vault.
The nightmare truly broke open for the public in May of 1999. Police were led to this abandoned bank vault and found 6 large plastic barrels sitting inside. When a detective finally pried the lid off the very first barrel, they were met with a sight straight out of a horror movie. A mummified human foot was protruding from this dark, sludgy liquid, tangled up with dirty clothing and hunched-up remains. And those barrels? They were completely filled with hydrochloric acid. In that one surreal, terrifying moment, what had started out as a simple missing persons inquiry instantly transformed into the most horrific homicide investigation in Australian history.
Section 1. The Discovery. A grotesque jigsaw puzzle.
From a strictly forensic standpoint, the most shocking detail police had to process is the number 8. Inside those 6 barrels, investigators found the dismembered remains of 8 distinct individuals. Now you might be wondering, if they were totally submerged in acid, how are they still preserved enough to count? Well, the killers used hydrochloric acid, thinking it would completely dissolve the evidence. But they forgot a crucial detail. The human body has a massive percentage of water. That natural water effectively neutralized the acid. So instead of dissolving, the bodies were kept perfectly preserved in this bizarre, sterile, oxygen-deprived environment. That one massive mistake by the killers allowed pathologists to recover fingerprints, tattoos, and even horrific evidence of the torture methods they used.
Bunting's web of hate, breaking down the group. Let's look at the who and the why behind all of this. So, who were the men behind this? First, you have John Bunting. He was the undeniable mastermind of the whole operation. He was actually incredibly charismatic to the people he wanted to control, but fundamentally deeply sadistic. He had this horrifying talent for finding vulnerable, malleable people, often young men with histories of trauma or abuse, and completely weaponizing their pain. Then you have Robert Wagner. Wagner was physically imposing and quickly became Bunting's unquestioning henchman. He was basically the muscle. He provided the backup Bunting needed to enforce his will. Bunting expertly manipulated Wagner's own past traumas, twisting him into a relentless, unthinking enforcer for the group.
Of course, Bunting needed a way to justify his extreme sadism to the others, and he found it by brewing up this delusional cocktail of vigilante justice. The guy actually built a literal web in his bedroom, like a map of yarn connecting all the people he hated. He harbored this intense, violent hatred for pedophiles, homosexuals, transgender individuals, and even people he just deemed overweight or weak. He used these incredibly flimsy, often completely fabricated accusations to justify targeting his victims. Basically, he convinced his accomplices that they were cleaning up society, when really, he was just masking his pure enjoyment of torture behind a twisted moral crusade.
But as much as Bunting loved playing the righteous vigilante, there was a very cold, pragmatic evil running right alongside his delusions. Over the course of the killings, the gang collected nearly $100,000 in fraudulent welfare and pension payments from the very people they had murdered. They would literally force their victims to hand over bank cards, PINs, and social security details right before killing them. It's this horrifying dual motive, right? Sadistic thrill-seeking, perfectly paired with calculated financial exploitation. Up next, torture, delusion, and murder.
You know what makes this case globally unique in the annals of true crime is actually the victimology. This wasn't some lone serial killer stalking strangers in the dark. Take a look at the relationships here. This group preyed almost exclusively on its own social and familial circle. Troy Yude and David Johnson, they were the half-brother and stepbrother of young accomplice James Vlasicus. Elizabeth Hayden was the wife of accomplice Mark Hayden. Frederick Brooks was his nephew. Bunting totally infiltrated a community, gained their absolute trust, and then systematically slaughtered them from the inside out.
And the methods they used were just unspeakably cruel. Bunting truly enjoyed the act of killing. Victims were subjected to this ritualistic, incredibly humiliating torture, involving tools like pliers, handcuffs, and electric shock machines. But perhaps the absolute most killingly calculated part of their whole process was the audio recordings. While victims were actively being tortured, Bunting forced them to record spoken messages. The gang would then take those tapes and play them over the phone to the victims' families, tricking them into believing their loved ones had simply packed up and moved away to start a new life. It was a devastatingly effective psychological trick that kept the police off their trail for years. Which naturally leads us to a massive question. If the killers were so meticulous at covering their tracks with these recorded messages and burying bodies in acid, how did they actually get caught? How did a seemingly mundane trail of missing welfare money lead straight to that horrific bank vault?
Let's get into unraveling the conspiracy. So, this unraveling happened in very distinct stages. Back in 1997, you just had these routine missing persons inquiries opening up in Adelaide's northern suburbs. By late 1998, accomplice Mark Hayden's wife Elizabeth was officially reported missing. That's when detectives really started connecting the dots. They noticed that several of these missing people were uniquely linked to 2 men, John Bunting and Robert Wagner. More importantly, they finally obtained security footage of Wagner withdrawing cash from a missing man's bank account. Police slapped wiretaps on them, set up surveillance, and in May 1999, they finally tracked the suspects as they drove 150 kilometers north to that quiet, disused bank in Snowtown.
Finding those barrels obviously triggered immediate arrests. First, they grabbed Bunting, Wagner, and Hayden. But the real structural break in the case came a few days later, when police arrested 19-year-old James Vlasakis. He had lived with Bunting and slowly been drawn into the killings. Completely crushed by the weight of the guilt, despair, and the sickening realization of what he had done to his own family members, Vlasakis broke the group's code of silence. He laid it all out. He gave detectives a complete roadmap, detailing all 12 murders, who the victims were, and exactly how and why they died. Without his confession, piecing together the full scale of this horror would have been nearly impossible.
Section: A Town Forever Stigmatized. Looking at the geographic breakdown of the murders, there is a really terrible irony here. This case is known all over the world as the Snowtown murders, and yet 11 of the 12 murders actually took place in the suburbs of Adelaide, over 100 kilometers away. Only one victim, David Johnson, was actually killed inside that Snowtown bank vault, and that was long after the gang had rented it to store the other bodies. None of the killers lived in Snowtown, none of the victims were from Snowtown. Yet this innocent town's name became permanently etched into the history of Australia's absolute worst serial killing.
And the legacy they left behind is it's incredibly unsettling. For a long time, the town seriously debated changing its name just to escape the stigma. While the initial media circus brought a really brief economic boost, it also brought a wave of gross, dark tourism. I mean, morbid souvenirs like fridge magnets reading "Snowtown SA, you'll have a barrel of fun," literally began circulating. The locals, who had absolutely nothing to do with this horrific violence, are forced to endure sightseers taking photos of the old bank. They're just living indefinitely in the shadow of John Bunting's crimes.
The judicial outcomes, thankfully, ensured the ringleaders would never walk free again. This trial dragged on for over a year. It was actually the longest in South Australia's history. John Bunting received 11 consecutive life sentences with zero possibility of parole. Robert Wagner got 10 life sentences, also with no parole. James Vlasakis, the one whose confession actually broke the case wide open, received 4 life sentences. He recently tried for parole, but it was overturned, so he remains behind bars. Mark Hayden, who was convicted of assisting in the cover-up rather than the murders themselves, was actually released on parole in 2024 after serving 25 years.
But you know what stands out the most from that massive trial? The absolute, chilling defiance of the killers. There was zero remorse, not a single tear for the victims. During the proceedings, the jury was actually shown a poem written by Robert Wagner. The concluding line read, "You know, I'm not a bad guy for a serial killer." Just think about that. It is a chilling testament to the total lack of empathy and the terrifying delusions of grandeur these men stubbornly held on to, even as they were being locked away forever.
Which leaves us with a pretty profound, albeit heavy, question to consider today. The Snowtown case wasn't just about the physical act of murder. It was about a master manipulator turning vulnerable, broken people into absolute monsters and convincing them that their cruelty was perfectly justified. When absolute manipulation meets vulnerable minds, are there any limits to human depravity? Well, sadly, the bodies in the barrel suggest there really are not. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. I know it's a heavy topic, but analyzing these dark realities is absolutely crucial to understanding the true extremes of human behavior. I will see you in the next one.
All right, welcome back to part 4 of our 5-part explainer series, diving into the darkest chapters of Australian criminology. Today, we're dropping right into the terrifying events of November 1986. We're exploring a case that literally shocked the nation, the Moorhouse murders. We're going to examine the deadly partnership of David and Catherine Burney over in Perth, and crucially, the absolutely incredible, brave escape of their final intended victim, Kate Moore.
I've got the munchies. Now, you hear that and it sounds completely innocent, right? But this was actually a chilling code phrase. It signaled that David and Catherine Burney had just found their next victim on the streets of Perth. As they'd cruise around looking for vulnerable women, Catherine would spot someone and casually utter those exact words. And if David liked the look of the woman, he'd reply, "I've got the munchies too," basically sealing her fate. It's a really stark reminder of how everyday, mundane language can be twisted to kick off unimaginable horrors.
So we begin right in the passenger seat of their car with 17-year-old Kate Moore. It's November 9th, and she had just accepted what she totally thought was a harmless lift from this very ordinary-looking couple. But then, suddenly, there's a knife held to her throat. She was abducted, handcuffed, and forced into this utterly terrifying fight for her life inside a perfectly normal-looking suburban home. Let's get into Section 1, Origins of a Deadly Bond.
To really understand how Kate ended up in this nightmare, we have to peel back the layers of her captors, David and Catherine Burney. Criminologists classify the Reign of Terror as a prime example of a co-offending dynamic. Basically, this is a deadly symbiotic relationship where two damaged psychologies just fuel one another. Neither of them might have escalated to serial murder on their own, but together, their shared delusions and the way they dominated each other created this vicious cycle of severe violence where they just constantly egged each other on. They operated on a really distinct dominant-submissive axis. Think of David as essentially the puppet. He was the primary physical aggressor, totally driven by extreme paraphilic or atypical sexual desires. Catherine, on the other hand, was the puppeteer. She was the active observer, the facilitator, and the psychological enforcer who very often encouraged and orchestrated David's brutal actions.
And this twisted connection didn't just pop up out of nowhere. It started way back in childhood. They actually met when they were just 12 and were romantically involved by 14. Their teenage years just festered with petty crime, theft, and stints in youth prison. Eventually, they separated and went on to live these seemingly normal lives in separate marriages. But when they reunited in 1985, that old toxic bond cemented into something far, far worse, finally culminating when they moved in together at 3 Morehouse Street in Willagee.
Moving on to Section 2, the Morehouse Street victims. What happened next behind the closed doors of that ordinary home was an absolute explosion of violence. Just look at the terrifying speed of this timeline. October 6th, Mary Nielsen. October 20th, 15-year-old Susanna Candy. November 1st, Nolene Patterson. And November 5th, Denise Brown. In mere weeks, 4 innocent women were abducted, brutally assaulted at the Morehouse property, and then transported to nearby pine forests where they were murdered and buried in shallow graves. Now, the internal dynamic between the killers was intensely jealous and incredibly volatile. When David actually formed a brief emotional attachment to their third victim, Nolene Patterson, he even kept her alive for days. Catherine's deep-seated insecurity flared up. She laid down a fatal ultimatum. David had to execute Nolene right then to prove his loyalty, or Catherine was going to kill herself. Driven by this intense psychological control, David forced sleeping pills down Nolene's throat and strangled her. Now for Section 3, Kate Moyer's brave escape. This brings us right back to November 9th, 1986, and 17-year-old Kate Moore. When Kate bravely confronted her captors and asked if they were going to rape her or kill her, she was met with this horrific, chilling threat: "We'll only rape you if you're good." Faced with that, Kate absolutely refused to just become victim number 5. Her survival instincts kicked into overdrive. She actually played along using reverse psychology to deliberately befriend Catherine and gain her trust, all while secretly hiding evidence around the house to prove she'd been there. Her incredible patience paid off the morning after she was taken. David left for work, which left Kate alone with Catherine. Then, a single split-second lapse in Catherine's attention happened. She went to the front door to answer a knock for a drug deal, and, crucially, she forgot to chain Kate back to the bed. This was the tiny, fleeting window of opportunity Kate so desperately needed. Running on pure adrenaline, Kate didn't hesitate for a single second. She managed to break the lock on a nearby window and forced her way through. In her frantic rush to get out, she took a brutal fall out onto the driveway, hitting her head incredibly hard on the concrete. But she just kept moving. Half naked, injured, and absolutely terrified, she ran frantically down the alleyway. She vaulted over a gate, fought off an attack by the Burney's own dog, and just sprinted for her life, desperately knocking on neighbors' doors that, tragically, went unanswered. Finally, her terrifying physical ordeal ended when she burst into a local vacuum cleaner shop and found safety. She immediately spoke to the police, and, while some were initially skeptical of this wild story, 22-year-old Constable Laura Hancock believed her completely. She recognized the incredibly precise details Kate was able to provide. Because Kate's survival wasn't just physical, right? It was her brilliant mental presence during the whole ordeal. She memorized David's real name from a medicine bottle she spotted. She took mental notes that they had watched a VHS copy of Rocky. She even left a hidden drawing in the house as proof. She basically left this undeniable breadcrumb trail that gave the police exactly the concrete evidence they needed to secure a search warrant for the Morehouse property. Which takes us to Section 4, Justice and the Aftermath. With that warrant secured, the house was raided, and the couple was taken into custody. Now, initially, the Burneys denied absolutely everything. But then, a brilliant tactical bluff by Detective Sergeant Vince Cottage blew the case wide open. He just casually threw out the line, "It's getting dark, let's get the shovel and go and dig 'em up." Astonishingly, this bluff resulted in David's shocking confession, which led authorities straight into the forest to make the devastating discovery of the 4 hidden graves.
Since this is part of our wider criminology explainer on Australian killers, it's really interesting to see how the Bernie's sentencing aligns with other notorious offenders of the era. Much like Ivan Milat and the Snowtown killers Bunting and Wagner, the Bernies received incredibly severe penalties, 4 terms of life imprisonment each. This removed them entirely from society and, thankfully, ended their twisted co-offending dynamic for good.
They were permanently separated in the prison system, though. Wildly enough, they still managed to exchange over 2,600 letters. But the psychological spell was eventually broken. David ultimately took his own life in his cell in 2005. As for Catherine, her parole bids have been repeatedly denied, and her papers are officially marked never to be released, stripping them forever of that sick power they once shared.
5. That is the total number of known victims abducted into 3 Morehouse Street. 4 vibrant, innocent women lost their lives to this horrific partnership. But thanks to one incredible survivor, the terror decisively stopped there. So, as we wrap up this explainer, I really want you to remember not the depravity of these killers, but the undeniable courage of Kate Moore. Think about her resilience. A 17-year-old girl who kept her wits about her, saved her own life, and undoubtedly saved the lives of countless other women who would have been next. What does her survival tell us about the human spirit's amazing ability to triumph against the absolute darkest of odds? Thanks so much for joining me for part 4, and I'll see you in the next explainer.
Welcome back, everyone. Okay, let's dive right into this final explainer of our 5-part series. You know, over the course of this whole series, we've really dug deep into the terrifying realities of Australia's most notorious serial killers, looking at the data, the criminology, and, of course, the absolute devastation they leave behind in communities. But today, we're bringing it all together to look at the ultimate equalizer in solving Australia's darkest mysteries, modern forensic science. We're going to examine 2 vastly different sprees, the Claremont serial killings and the Frankston murders, to really understand how justice is ultimately delivered.
So think about this for a second. How exactly do you catch a monster who seemingly leaves absolutely zero trace behind? It's a truly agonizing question, and it perfectly frames the massive hurdle law enforcement faced in the 2 sprees we're looking at today. When an offender strikes seemingly at random, your usual motives, like money or a personal grudge, well, they just vanish. Police are left totally grasping at shadows. They're forced to rely on either the killer making a really brash, stupid mistake, or the slow, microscopic evolution of scientific analysis. Part 1: 7 weeks of terror. Let's look at the Frankston murders.
It's hard to even wrap your head around how fast Paul Denyer's violent attacks against women escalated over just a few weeks back in 1993. In June, 18-year-old Elizabeth Stevens was murdered on her way home from a bus stop. Then, just weeks later, 22-year-old Deborah Freem was abducted during a really quick run to the shops for milk, tragically leaving her 12-day-old son at home. And then shortly after that, 17-year-old Natalie Russell was attacked walking home from school. As you can imagine, the community was absolutely paralyzed with fear.
7. Just 7 weeks. That is literally all it took for Denyer to leave this massive trail of devastation before his spree finally ended. Police found cuts in a wire fence near the final crime scene, traced a suspicious car to Denyer, and brought him in. And Denyer? He was shockingly brash. When they confronted him, he boastfully confessed to the whole thing. He actually told investigators he'd wanted to kill since he was 14, purely out of a general hatred for women. He was caught quickly, mainly because of his own escalating frenzy and his physical proximity to the crimes.
Moving on to Part 2, the Claremont Nightmares.
Now let's head over to Western Australia, to Perth. Between January 1996 and March 1997, 3 young women vanished from the Claremont Entertainment District after a night out. First, 18-year-old Sarah Spears. Then, 23-year-old childcare worker Jane Rimmer. And finally, 27-year-old lawyer Sierra Glennon. The bodies of Rimmer and Glennon were eventually found dumped in bushland at completely opposite ends of Perth, but tragically, Sarah Spears has never been found and is presumed dead. For 20 years, the killer just lived quietly among the public. It's like he was a ghost.
You know, looking at this, the contrast between these 2 offenders is just night and day. On one hand, you have Paul Denyer, who was caught super quickly after a chaotic, boastful blitz. On the other, you have Bradley Robert Edwards, the man who would eventually be identified as the Claremont Killer. He meticulously evaded the law for 2 solid decades in total silent denial. So how do you bridge a 20-year gap when the trail has gone completely freezing cold? Well, you wait for the science to catch up.
Which brings us to part 3, Science Catches a Ghost.
When you're chasing someone who leaves virtually no visible clues at a scene, you have to look closer. A lot closer. And the absolute game changer in the Claremont case was low copy number, or LCN, DNA analysis. Standard DNA testing back in the day required a pretty large volume of genetic material, but LCN? It essentially lets scientists take these tiny, practically invisible, sub-nanogram amounts of cellular debris and amplify them to build a workable profile. It pushed Australian forensic science to its absolute limits, and crucially, it shifted the power right back from the killer to the victims.
Using this LCN tech, they got a monumental breakthrough in 2008. They finally found the silent testimony Ciara Glennon left behind. See, while she was fighting desperately for her life in 1997, she scratched her attacker. Deep beneath her left thumb and middle fingernail, scientists found cellular debris. And with this new technology, boom, they successfully extracted a male DNA profile. They finally had the killer's biological signature.
But here's the crazy part. Extracting that DNA in 2008? That was really just step 1. They still didn't have a name. It took 8 more years before that exact profile was matched to evidence from an unsolved 1995 abduction at Karrakatta Cemetery and a stolen kimono dropped during a 1988 break-in. Suddenly, all these separate, terrifying threads pointed directly to one man, a 51-year-old former Telstra technician named Bradley Robert Edwards. The net had finally closed.
And get this, DNA wasn't his only mistake. Far from it. Beyond the biology, forensic textile scientists found over 90 critical polyester fibers in the victim's hair and on their bodies. When they analyzed them, they identified the color as Telstra Navy. The exact dye and polymer signature perfectly matched the mid-90s work uniforms issued to Telstra employees, which is exactly what Edwards wore. On top of that, fibers from the company-issued vehicles he drove were also tied to the victims. It was just an inescapable physical link. I want to pause on this number right here for a second. Just 1%. According to the Australian Institute of Criminology, serial murders represent barely 1% of all homicides in Australia. Yet, as we've seen throughout this explainer, these incredibly rare but devastating crimes literally force innovation. They drive these sweeping, monumental modifications in our forensic capabilities and our entire criminal justice system.
And that leads us to our final section, Part 4, Justice for the Victims.
At the end of the day, the entire purpose of this massive, exhausting investigative effort is to ensure justice is served for these victims and their families. As you can see, both men had been permanently removed from society to serve life sentences. Paul Denyer received 3 consecutive life sentences, and his bid for parole is flatly denied in 2023. Bradley Robert Edwards, after this massive 7-month trial in 2020, was sentenced to life imprisonment with a 40-year non-parole period for the murders of Jane Rimmer and Ciara Glennon.
But of course, our justice system requires proof beyond a reasonable doubt for every single charge. And while Edwards was convicted for 2 of the murders, he was actually acquitted of the murder of Sarah Spires. As Justice Stephen Hall stated during the trial, though her body has never been found, the only reasonable conclusion is that she is dead. It's an absolutely tragic reality for Sarah's family. Her remains have yet to be located, leaving them with a painful, lingering question. And with that, we wrap up our 5-part explainer series. We've gone from the rapid, chaotic brutality of the Frankston murders being stopped in weeks to the patient, relentless evolution of forensic science that finally caught the Claremont killer decades later. It really leaves you with something profound to chew on. If a few microscopic cells from under a fingernail can solve the 20-year-old mystery today, whose secrets will the science of tomorrow uncover? Thanks so much for joining me on this deep dive. Keep questioning, keep learning, and I'll see you in the next explainer.
You don't belong in the sour bell, well tied to the lights. Uncool the anaconda, propaganda, funder, stunder, rise. Plan every revolution from the truth within the fucking sea. No greed. The federal, general, mineral police plan, broad fraud, guide rod, tried side. Of seats digging up the bog clog,
Yeah! Skippity skip Kern!
My passport,
8,
export resort,
6, Dresden! Let's fucking go! Let's fucking go!
Bureaucratic, energetic race. Minister, sinister, finister, toad in his gown, down, brown, frown, down mode. Try and drag the heavy heavy levy load. How'd you kill a Ned Kelly with a bulletproof fire? Roof poof. Gang in the fight, keeping the island fire pile tire, right? Burning fucking bright. The national